for their niece, Chava Tzipporah, Bas Chaya Malka. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, she together with Kol Cholei Yisroel have a complete and enduring refuah. To thank our Day of Learning sponsor, Robyn Schaffer, for dedicating the learning today in loving memory of her husband, Edward Schaffer, Usher Herschel, Ben Avraham Shmuel, in commemoration of his third yahrzeit. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, the Neshama will have an aliyah and the family a nechama. But with that, let us begin. Hopefully everyone had a beautiful Yom Tiv. Welcome back to everyone. Yashikoach to Rabbi Venek and Reb Kalman Akiva for giving shir Baruch Hashem over Shabbos and over the 2 days of Yom Tiv. And also with that, let us begin. Tzadik Beis Amud Aleph, 4 lines down from the top. So the Mishnah said as follows: Niseis al pi Beis Din Teitzei. So just to reorient ourselves a little bit with this particular case. So the Mishnah said as follows: that halacha l'maisa, if the woman got remarried on the basis of the testimony of an Eid Echad, that's what it means over here, api Beis Din. She got remarried on the basis of the testimony of an Eid Echad, Teitzei. Now again, what happens? Then her husband ends up being alive, right? Ultimately, he didn't die. The Eid Echad was wrong. So the halacha is that she has to go ahead and leave both husbands. So the Gemara says as follows: Amr Zeiri. So it's a very interesting discussion. So Zeiri says as follows: Lesa lemas nisin meditani be midrasha. The Mishnah is really no longer in effect. The Mishnah really no longer applies. Ultimately, again, based on what we learned in the Beis Medrash, Tetani Bei Midrasha, what was taught inside of the Beis Medrash, Horu Beis Din Sheshaka Chama Ulbasov Zarcha. So we'll say a very interesting case. Following scenario. Let's say halacha l'maisa says follows: Beis Din went ahead and made a psak halacha. Right? What was their psak halacha? That the sun set. But it turned out after the fact that halacha l'maisa the sun was still up. Now we'll say, what's the case over here? Look at Rashi. Rashi says, Horu Beis Din Sheshaka Chama b'Shabbos. So we're talking about a case over here, thank you, a case over here on Shabbos, thank you. On Shabbos, they went ahead and they ruled that the day was already over. Rashi says over here, b'Shabbos, ve'etir lasos malacha. So let's imagine the following scenario. So it's Shabbos, Beis Din paskind, so to speak, Shabbos was over. It turns out that Shabbos wasn't over. What was it? It was a very cloudy day. So then the sun comes out. So now remember again, it turns out that halacha l'maisa, everyone ended up doing melacha, based on the psak of Beis Din. So what's the halacha in this case? Ein zu hora'ah ela taos. This is not considered a halachic ruling. Rather, what is this considered? A mistake. Then I will say, this is a fascinating idea. Take a look at Rashi for just a moment. Ein zu hora'ah. Then I will say, now you think about it for just a moment. Either way, right? Are the people liable? No, because at the end of the day, they were simply following the advice of Beis Din, right? It was not their intention to do anything wrong. So where in exactly lies the nafkamina over here? So look at Rashi. Ein zu hora'ah. Lismo chalel, beliftar yachid sha'asa PM, oim asu tzibor apiem, ein mevim par kishar helam davar. So I will say, here's what's interesting. There's a concept called par helam davar minat tzibor, which is if the tzibor, or even a group, acts in accordance with an erroneous psak Beis Din, there's a certain level of individual coverage in a scenario like that, right? So, thank you. So, halacha l'maisa again, if the tzibor acts, Beis Din rules, and the tzibor goes in and acts in accordance with that ruling. So there's a certain level of coverage in terms of that each individual doesn't have to bring his own carbon chatos. Instead, there's what's called a par helam davar minat tzibor, a specific type of communal offering that is brought. What the Gemara is pointing out over here, something very interesting, or Zeiri is pointing out over here, is that in a case like this, there is individual liability. Look at Rashi. He goes on, he says, Ela kol echad kisba o seira. Everyone has to bring their own individual carbon. She'in ze helam davar ela taos. Shabbos said, this is fascinating. There's a distinction between when Beis Din makes an erroneous ruling based on a misunderstanding of legal principles versus a mistake in mitzias. I don't know what's the good English word for mitzias. Circumstances, right? Circumstantial reality. And this is a great case. Right? We'll say it's Shabbos, it's very dark outside. Beis Din Paskin, clap on the bima, right? Shabbos is over. Everyone goes out to buy pizza, right? And then it turns out that what happens? The sun comes out. So we'll say, that's not a mistake based on a misunderstanding of a legal principle. What is that a mistake on? What is that a mistake based on? Mitzias, right? Just reality. So Ziri, so we'll say in a carbonic principle, elatos kisvurim sheba ba'olam davar shelo ba. See, the mistake over here is they thought it was night. They just want to say it's not night. It's not night. So to the halakuli alma gal yahashta det hasavi. And I will say, so wherein lies the distinction between a mistake in legal principles versus a mistake in circumstantial reality? A mistake in circumstantial reality becomes revealed de facto. Right? In other words, the sun comes out. V'hacha nami demasnisin taosi kisvurim shemes v'hine ba baila v'akol roem ella a'eit samoch. So I'll say, so here's a perfect example. What happened? Eid Echad came along, said, Rachel, your husband died. Then what happens? Right, Rachel, your husband Reuven died. Then what happened? Reuven showed up. So I'll say, this isn't a mistake in legal principles, right? This is a mistake in mitzias. Again, I will say, to be very clear, no malicious. We're assuming no malicious intent over here, right? There's not anyone lying. Again, we relied on it. It's just like Beis Din ruled, Shabbos is over. They made a mistake. So I will say, what's interesting, we're going to see why this is important in just a little. Well, it's important now because we're going to see from a carbonic perspective. I mean, there's not a carbonic perspective. Well, there is a carbonic perspective by the woman, which we're going to get to in the next section. But right now, there's just a fundamental discussion. Zeiri is saying, by the way, if an Eid Echad shows up and says, Rachel, your husband Reuven died, right? Rachel gets remarried. And then what happens? Husband shows up. So what's the halacha? Teitzei mizeh umizeh. She has to go and leave both husbands. Zeiri says, by the way, this halacha l'maisa is not a situation of an erroneous halachic ruling. This is more resembling the case of the Shabbos case, where they paskin Shabbos was over, but in fact Shabbos wasn't over. So this is not what we call, it's not a hora'ah, but rather it's a tos. Rav Nachman Amar horahi. Rav Nachman says no, that is incorrect. This, when Beis Din accepts the ruling of an Eid Echad, that acceptance of an Eid Echad has the status of a hora'ah, of a psak Beis Din. So Amar Rav Nachman. So we'll say, so just understand, we're going to see, by the way, the nafkamina is going to be, like I alluded to before, of exemption from a carbon also. You see, anytime you act under the guidance of Beis Din, you are shielded from personal liability for a carbon. Verse is if you go ahead and just do something, you may do something innocently, but it's not because of a psak Beis Din. There is personal carbonic liability. So Rav Nachman says, this is a hora'ah. This is a psak Beis Din. So the Gemara says, how do we know this? Amar Rav Nachman, Teida dorahi. This is definitely a hora'ah. I'll tell you how. TORAH kula eid echad lo mehemen, v'hacha mehemen. It's very simple. We'll say Eid Echad is never believed. Now, that's not totally true. Eid Echad is sometimes believed, but generally, Eid Echad is not believed. And yet here, Eid Echad is believed. My taima, lav mishum dorahi. What's the reason why Eid Echad is believed? It must be because over here, this is a psak Beis Din. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says over here, Teda dorahi, aide horaz Beis Din hineses, va'alayhu talya. So I will say, listen to the mechanics over here. See, here's the fundamental machlokes. When a woman gets remarried based on the eidos of an Eid Echad, what is she really getting married based on? So Zeiri will say she's getting married based on the eidos of the Eid Echad. Right? Again, halacha is allowing her to do it, but it's not really a psak Beis Din. It's based on the Eid Echad. Therefore, when a husband shows back up, at the end of the day, she didn't get married based on a hora'ah, based on a psak, but rather she got married based on a tos. And therefore, according to Zeiri, there would be personal carbonic liability. Rav Nachman says, no. She got married based on a psak beis din. How do we know that, says Rav Nachman? It's so fascinating. How do we know that? Because at the end of the day, she can't get married based on an eid echad. How do you know she can't get married based on an eid echad? How do you know? Because eid echad doesn't work. The only way eid echad could work is if beis din comes along and says, eid echad works. Which means that effectively then, she's not really getting married based on an eid echad, she's getting married based on a psak beis din. And if she's getting married based on a psak beis din, then what? Then she has liability coverage through the beis din. And therefore, halacha l'maisa, when husband number one shows back up, she does not have personal carbonic liability. It's quite amazing. I'm sorry. So she's still going to have to leave both husbands, because at the end of the day, it was a de facto, albeit inadvertent act of adultery, but the nafkamina is going to be in the realm of carbonic liability, right? Remember again, if you hold that she's getting married based on the eid echad, then it's a taos, it's a mistake. If it's a mistake, there's personal liability. If you hold that halacha l'maaseh she's getting married based on psak beis din, then there's coverage and no carbonic liability. So let's analyze. So Amar Rava. So Rava says, Teida de Taosu. So I'll say, ultimately, again, you could see that this is a Taos. That really, the way we look at this case, Rava says, is a case of a mistake. This is a mistake, right? She thought her husband was dead. The Eid Echad said her husband was dead. She accepted the advice of the Eid Echad, or the Eidus of the Eid Echad. She made a mistake. Husband wasn't dead. It's a taos. It's a mistake. It's not a psak beis din. And therefore, there will be personal liability. So how do I know this? The ilu horu beis din, listen to this. The ilu horu beis din, v'chelev ubedam lahetera. Let's listen to this case. Let's say there was a piece of meat. And beis din paskind that the piece of meat wasn't chelev, instead it was basar, right? It was basar, right? It was meat, right? Or bedam v'chadar chazu taima li'isura. And then Rabbi said, let's say they afterwards saw a reason to go ahead and prohibit that which they permitted. Ki hadri v'amri le'ater lo mashkechin lahu. Rabbi say, if beis din were to declare something aser, right? And then let's say, for example, we're to go ahead, I said the opposite. Beis din declares something to be asr, to be declared to be chelev. And then let's say, I will say afterwards, they decided, you know what? We see reason to deem this item permitted. Lo mashkechin lahu. We would not listen to them. Let's say, once beis din makes a psak halacha, that psak halacha remains. The ilu heicha, the asr, but yet, so we'll say, in other words, what's happening over here says like this. Rava says, the hallmark of a psak beis din is that it remains in effect. That's what happens with a psak beis din. So beis din paskin, this piece of meat is chelev. Afterwards, they say, you know what? Maybe there's room to say that it's really basar. No, case is closed. You paskind. That's halacha. Yet Rabbi say, what's happening in this case? Ve'ilu heicha da'asa eid echad sharina. Yet Rabbi say, let's play this out. Rachel's married to Reuven. Right, Reuven goes overseas for travel. Eid Echad shows up and tells Rachel, by the way, Reuven died. Okay. Rachel gets remarried. Asu Trey Asarna, 2 witnesses go ahead and show up and say Reuven's still alive. So we'll say, what would happen? What would happen in that case? Then we would go ahead and essentially negate the eidos of the Eid Echad, right? And go ahead and restore her back as an Eishes Ishta Reuven. And then I will say, what happens? Ki hadar asa Eid Achrina Sharila. I will say, watch this. If another Eid Echad were to show up and say, you know what, Reuven died, what would be the halacha? Ultimately, we permit her to get remarried. So we'll say, this is an extreme case, right? Of an Eid Echad, 2 witnesses come along and say the Eid Echad was wrong, and then another Eid Echad shows up and says Reuven died. We would believe that last Eid Echad. And I will say, what does that show you? My taima, lav mishum de ta'osu. I will say, why is that? Because at the end of the day, we're not really dealing with a psak beis din. We're not really dealing with a psak beis din. Right? I will say, what are we dealing with over here? We're dealing with beis din allowing a woman to conduct herself based on mitzvah. So I will say, this is really the underpinning of this entire sugya. What did the Gemara say? Why is it that halacha l'maisa we allow a woman to rely on an Eid Echad to get remarried? We saw this. Mishum iguna Akilu barabanan. See, Rabbi say, at the end of the day, we are stuck between a rock and a hard place. We don't want a woman to remain in aguna, but at the same time, we also don't have a fully valid halachic mechanism with which to allow her to remarry. So essentially what we do is we do the best with what we have. And we assume that a woman is going to do the best, going to do her due diligence with the Eid Echad to make sure that there is veracity to his claim. But Lamaisa, what the Gemara is suggesting over here is when Beis Din allows her to remarry, it's not really a psak Beis Din. It's not a psak Beis Din. What is it? What is it? It's Beis Din saying mitzias. Mitzias right now is that there's an Eid Echad. Let her get married based on the edus of the Eid Echad. It's incredible. Va'af Rabbi Eliezer savar de tosu. Even Rabbi Eliezer holds that halacha l'maisa. Ultimately, we'll say when we say it's a tos means that when husband number one, Reuven, shows back up, the way we look at what unfolded over here is that this was a mistake. Remember again, we're comparing Beis Din's actions to what? To the case of Shabbos, where they declared Shabbos was over, but Shabbos wasn't really over. What's the halacha in that case? So we don't view that as a mistake in psak halacha. We view that as a mistake in mitzios, right? A mistake in just circumstantial reality. So there, and again, I will say, what does it mean if it's a mistake in circumstantial reality? It means that there's no carbonic liability. Each individual is liable for what they have done. So even Rabbi Eliezer holds that it's a tos. The Sanya, Rabbi Eliezer Omer, Yikov hadin esahar, the tavi chatos shmena. So I said, Lashon is very interesting. Let the din, let justice, right? Let true justice pierce the mountain, and she has to bring a big fat chatos. Right? Now, what's really a big fat chatos? So it's trying to drive the point home over here that there is personalistic liability. I will say, again, we want to be clear. Rachel did not act in any malicious fashion, right? And Rachel was following the process. To be clear, she's in the right. She did what she was allowed to do. But Lemais, again, now when husband number one shows up, this was a taos. It's not a psak Beis Din. And because ultimately, again, it's a taos, therefore, there's personal liability. To which the Gemara says, "I amrit bishlama taosu mishum hachi masya karban." So I'll say, if you hold that halacha l'maisa, we look at her act like a taos, like a mistake of Beis Din, which therefore gives her personalistic liability. That's why she has to bring a chatos. Elei amrit horahi amai masya karban. But if halacha l'maisa, we view this as a true psak Beis Din, and she was just following the psak Beis Din, then why would she be obligated to bring a carbon? To which the Gemara says, "V'dilma kasav Rabbi Eliezer yachid shasav haraz Beis Din chayiv." Maybe Rabbi Eliezer himself holds that even an individual who follows the psak Beis Din still has to bring a carbon. If that's the case, the Gemara says, "Imkein mayikov hadin es hahar." Then why does he need that phrase? Let justice pierce the mountain. So Rabbi say, this is an absolutely fascinating machlokes. Rabbi say, a riveting machlokes, because the truth is, what it also does is it frames for us in general. Beis Din makes different kinds of Beis Din makes mistakes. How do we know Beis Din makes mistakes? Because Rabbi say, the Torah has the concept of par helam davar min hatzibur. And par davar min hatzibur means when Beis Din makes a mistake that impacts Klal Yisroel, and Klal Yisroel acts based on the mistake of Beis Din. There's a special type of carbon. But Rabbi say, what we begin to see from this sugya is there's two types of errors. There's what's called a legal error and a mitzias error. So a legal error comes about in a misunderstanding, or misinterpretation, or a misapplication of a legal principle. When that happens and Klal Yisrael acts based on that, there is personal coverage. There's no personal liability. The tzibor brings a carbon. But when Beis Din paskins based on a mistake in mitzias, just based on a mistake on circumstantial reality, in that case, there is no tzibor coverage and there is personal liability. So I will say, so again, the shaila, the machlokes is, what do we do in this case of Eid Echad? Is the case of allowing a woman, well, by the way, remember, the Mishnah says, when you allow a woman to remarry based on Eid Echad, we call that what? Al pi Beis Din. So I will say, how do you view that? Rachel, right? Eid Echad shows up in Beis Din. Says, Rachel, your husband died. Beis Din says, okay, Rachel, you can get remarried. Now what happens? Husband shows up. What's the shaila, Rabbosai? What's the shaila? The fact that she has to leave both men, that's understood. What's the shaila? What's our question? Carbonic liability. Does she have to bring a carbon or not? What does it depend on? What does it depend on? How do we view the acceptance of Eid Echad? Is the acceptance of Eid Echad considered to be a psak bezdin? If it's a psak bezdin, then there is personal coverage, personal liability coverage. She doesn't bring her own carbon, or no? It's a ta'os. It's a mistake of bezdin based on circumstantial reality. Machlokes, Zeiri and Rav Nachman. So I will say, interestingly enough, the way the Rambam Paskins is like Zeiri, and we view this case as a ta'os. We view this case as a mistake of circumstantial reality on the part of Beis Din, and therefore there will be personal liability for this one. Like Rabbi Eliezer says, she's got to bring a big fat chatos. That's the halacha. Incredible, I will say. Also a good Musar Haskell. Very good Musar Haskell. I will say, sometimes we make mistakes because of unavoidable realities. Right? That's like the case of making a mistake. Like when the common man makes a mistake based on a psak Beis Din, the common man can't be expected to know any better than the Beis Din. Right? So sometimes in life we make mistakes because halacha l'maisa, there's somewhat avoidable circumstances. There's some legal principle or some reality that I wasn't aware of. I misunderstood. So those kind of mistakes are understandable. And the truth is, and the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I'm not held responsible for those mistakes. But the mistakes that we make because of circumstantial realities, or because of circumstantial ambiguity, I would say the mistakes we make when we could have known better, should have known better, could have clarified things a little bit better, those mistakes we are held responsible for. Those mistakes, Chadash Baruch Hu says, you could have exercised a bit more due diligence. Beis Din, you could have waited a little bit longer to see if the cloud cover would dissipate, to see ultimately if Shabbos was over. Those are the kind of mistakes. The things that are beyond our control, the Chadash Baruch Hu doesn't hold us accountable for. The things that are within my control, those are the things that I'm held accountable for. Let's go weiter. Says the Gemara. Haro Beis Din linaseh. So we'll say next case. So the Mishnah said that if Beis Din gave her a heter to remarry, right? So Eid Echad came along, Beis Din accepted, so to speak, right, the testimony of the Eid Echad, and then they paskin she could get remarried. We'll say what happened. She then went ahead. The Mishlav Shel Mishnah was v'zinsa. She engaged in immorality. In that case, everyone agrees that she is chayeves in a carbon. She's being a carbon for active immorality. Now, I will say, just to understand, the cases are all tied together. So, Eid Echad shows up, Rachel, Ruvain died, so Beis Din says, okay, get remarried. Then what happens? She engages in immorality, and Ruvain comes back. Right? Ruvain comes back. So now, I will say, halacha l'maisa, she's chayeves a carbon for the acts of immorality. Says the Gemara, my kilkula, when you say she behaved immorally, what are we talking about over here? Rabbi Eliezer Omer, zinsa. Rabbi Eliezer says, literally again, zinsa. And I will say, in this context, zinsa just means she just was immoral with men. She didn't marry anyone. She just had casual relationships with men. There's liability there. Rabbi Yochanan Omer, Almana l'kohen gadol grusha v'chalutza l'kohen hedyot. Rabbi Yochanan says, no. What are we talking about over here? That halacha l'maisa, she's now an almana. She married a kohen gadol, or she was a grusha. Right, let's say Abba says she was a divorcee from a previous marriage, or a chalutza, she married a kohen hedyot. So what's in Rabbi Yochanan's view, what she did over here is she engaged in a relationship that was literally punishable by a lav. Man damer zinsa kol shekina amar lekohen gadol. So I'll say the opinion who says zinsa, he certainly would agree that if she was if she was a grusha married or an almana married a kohen gadol, of course there'd be liability, because those are biblically prescribed relationships. Man damer almana lekohen gadol va zinsa lo. I will say, but the one who said the case of almana lekohen gadol said that's the case where there'd be a prohibition, because again that's a biblically prohibited relationship. But just stam zinsa. I don't mean just like stam zinsa, but I'll say if she just went out in a relationship with another man, there would not be carbonic liability. Why is there not carbonic liability? Because we'll say at the time that she engaged in this casual relationship, she assumed that she was an unmarried woman, right? That's what she assumed. So we'll say, my timer, The Amra Asun Hu Dishavisan Pnuya. Because ultimately, again, she could say, you are the ones who made me a single woman. In other words, the say she could claim, look, fine, you want to tell me that I'm not acting in accordance with the highest moral standard, that's fine, but Lamaisa, did I do anything quote unquote wrong? Did I do anything prohibited? At the end of the day, you told me I was single. So because I was single, I had this relationship. Now, again, and I did it based on Beis Din. I did not go out and just simply behave in a careless, immoral fashion. Tanya Kavase Rabbi Yochanan, suppose you have Bryce that supports Rabbi Yochanan. Haru Beis Din linase, the halcha the kilkala. So we'll say if Beis Din paskna, she can get remarried based on an Eid Echad, and she went out, the kilkala, she was just behaved in an immoral fashion. She didn't get married, but she was just immoral with another man. I'm sorry. Hilchah the kilkala. Kigon. Amar the kohen gadol. Grusha v'chalutza the kohen hadyot. Chayeves b'karban al kol bia ubia divrei Rabbi Eliezer. So we'll say, Rabbi Eliezer says that Allah chalamaisa, right? She got the psak from Beis Din. She went out the kilkala, and here Abba the Bryce says explicit. What does it mean kilkala? She engaged in an illegal marriage. What's the halacha? She is chayeves for every single bia. We will say every single bia with the same man. Chayeves every single bia. They're Rabbi Eliezer. The chum say no. Carbon echad alakol. Chum say no. She's only chayev one carbon per marriage, right? Not chayev for every single bia. Umodim chacham Rabbi Eliezer shemni says lechamisha b'nei adam. But even the chum agrees Rabbi Eliezer that if it turns out that she married 5 different men, shechayeves b'karban akol echad ve'echad, that she's chayeves a carbon for every single man. Hoil the gufin mechulakin. Ultimately, again, because they are separate bodies. So I will say, very interesting. So over here in our fundamental machlokas, when the Mishnah says zinsa chayeves b'karban, what type of zinsa are we talking about? Does zinsa mean essentially any sexual relationship, even outside of the context of marriage? Because it turns out that was adulterous as well. That's Rabbi Eliezer. Or zinsa, Rabbi Yochanan says, no, means the halacha l'maisa, she went ahead and she got married in an illegal fashion. As I will say, obviously, any marriage she's engaging in is illegal because it turns out that her husband was alive. But what it means illegal over here was a marriage that would have been illegal even had her husband been actually dead. So fundamental machlokas, the Rambam Paskins, again, like Rabbi Eliezer in this case, that from a carbonic perspective, Rabbi will say, it turns out that any relationship, any sexual relationship she has, she will ultimately generate carbonic liability. Why? Because Lamaisa, again, her husband was alive. It turns out her husband was alive. So we'll say, so ultimately, again, these two pieces kind of go together. In the first chilik of this Gemara, we learned that Allah Chalamaisa, we look at the Psak Beis Din, not really as the Psak Beis Din, but rather as what? As a tos, as a mistake. Because we look at it as a mistake, therefore there is personal liability, and therefore Allah Chalamaisa, if after receiving the license from Beis Din, she doesn't remarry, instead she just goes ahead and engages in casual relationships, there'll be personal liability ultimately for each of those relationships. Incredible. But say Mishnah, interesting case. Let's say, in this case, Rachel is married to Ruvain, and they have a son. And Ruvain and son go overseas. And what happens? So we'll say now, an interesting twist in this case. She is told now that her husband and son died, unfortunately, while overseas. But the order over here is very important. What is she told? First your husband died, and then your son died. And I will say, why is the order here very important? Because if husband died, if husband died, as long as at the time that husband died, there was what? A living child, a living son, there's no mitzvah yibum. So the testimony she got was your husband died, and then your son died. She heard this, v'nises, and therefore she got remarried. No yibum, she got remarried. So now she goes in, she marries Shimon, and then word comes that what? It was a mistake. Her son died, and then her husband died. See, I will say, if her son died and then her husband died, then what? She's subject to yibum. I will say, by the way, this is a very important. We've touched on this before, but this is often a nuance in yibum that sometimes goes overlooked. The obligation for yibum is generated at the time of death. So even if a couple has children, if those children predeceased the husband, so at the time of the husband's death, the husband is childless, halacha lemaisa, there is a yibum obligation. It's a really fascinating idea. So Rabbi says, so now this woman acted again in complete compliance with the law. It just turns out that halacha lemaisa, she got wrong information. So now she married Shimon. Now word comes that she was in fact obligated in yibum to Ruvain's brother. What's the halacha? But so Teitzei va'avlad rishon va'achron mamzer. She has to leave Shimon. And her first and second children are mamzerim. Now, it's not clear what's meant by first and second children. We'll see this in the Gemara. Amrula meis b'nech va'achar meis balech. So we'll say reverse case. Let's say they tell Rachel, right, your son died first, and then your husband died. So what happens? Vinis yabma. As a result, she does yibum with Ruvain's brother Shimon. V'achar kach amrula chilav hayu advarim. And then afterwards, they tell her, we made a mistake. And in fact, your husband died first and then your son, which means what, Rabosai? She has illegally married her brother-in-law, which is an erva. She has to leave her brother-in-law, she has to leave Shimon. And ultimately, the first and second children are mamzerim. Again, Rabosai, we'll discuss what first and second mean in this type of situation as well. Weiter, says the Gemara, Amrullah, Meispalech. So we'll say, again, same case. Rachel's married to Ruvain. Ruvain goes overseas. They come back and they say, Rachel, your husband died. Vinises, she got remarried. Va'achar Amrullah, Kayim, Chaya Umeis. And then Rabbi said, then witnesses come back and say, we made a mistake. At the time we told you that he was dead, he was really alive, and he was alive through the time you got remarried. But now he's dead. So Rabbi said, right, Mazel Tov, right. So now he's dead. So Rabbi say, what's ta'alacha? Teitze, she has to leave her second husband, because remember again, at the time she married him, what? Husband, all right, time she married Shimon, husband number one was alive. V'havlad rishon mamzer, v'achron eno mamzer. Now, both say this case is clear. What does it mean, v'havlad rishon mamzer? A child that she initially had with Shimon, right? At the time that Reuven was still alive, that child is a mamzer. But technically speaking, if after hearing that Reuven is now dead, she were to remain with Shimon, albeit that's illegal, but she were to remain with Shimon and have children, those children would be what? Totally fine. So the Gemara says, Amrullah meis balech b'nis kadsha. So we'll say, they tell Rachel, your husband died, Ruvain died, and ultimately again, she has kiddushin with Shimon. V'achar kach ba baila. And then again, before Nisuin, Ruvain returns. What's the halacha? Mutaras lach zorlo. She is permitted to go back to Ruvain. So again, this is a different kind of case, because what happened in this case over here? There was only kiddushin. So because there was only kiddushin, therefore Rachel has not yet lived with Shimon. Because of that, she is permitted to go back to Ruvain. And I will say, even though now Shimon is going to give her a get. Now, why is Shimon giving her a get? Because they had kiddushin, even though halacha l'maisa, the kiddushin wasn't really valid, Shimon's going to give her a get, but this get in no way invalidates her from marrying into the kahuna. Why not? As Zudar Shabi Eliezer ben Masya, V'isha grusha mi'isha, v'lo mi'isha eno isha. I will say the only type of get that precludes a woman from marrying a Kohen is an isha grusha mi'isha, a woman who is divorced from a man. But Allah Lamaisa, if the woman is not divorced from the man, but rather the get is just given for what we call public policy, like this kind of case, that does not endow her even with the reach get, even with the scent of the get, and therefore there's no problem for her to marry the Kohen. Okay, good. Let's analyze the cases. So both say, let's go back to the first couple of cases. Remember again, in the first cases, what did we have? We had a woman whose husband and son, right? Ruvain and son went overseas. Rachel gets back testimony that what? Your husband died, or we'll say it, your husband died and then your son died, which she thought meant she was not subject to Yibum. So she goes and she remarries. Then it turns out that what happened? Chiluf hadvarim, the son died first before the husband, so she was subject to Yibum. So the Mishnah used the lashon of harishon. What was the lashon? Vlad rishon va'acharon mamzer. The first and second children are mamzerim. Says the Gemara, what is my rishon and my achron? What does that mean? So the Gemara says, if you say Rishon means before she heard the updated news, and Achron means after she heard the updated news, that can't be. Listening Havlad Mamzer. Just so we'll say, either way, the kid are Mamzerim. Right? So just say Havlad Mamzer. The Gemara says, you're right. Mishun the Kabayli Misni Seifa, Amrula Meis Baalech Venises, the Achrakach Amrula Kayim Haya Umeis, Harishon Mamzer Va'achron Eno Mamzer, Tananami Reisha, Rishon Va'achron Mamzer. So we'll say, the Gemara says something very interesting. We do this just to provide Mishnaic symmetry. See, we'll say, in the last case, what was the last case in Mishnah? They tell Rachel, Ruvain died. Rachel gets married to Shimon. Then witnesses come and say, by the way, Rachel, we were wrong the first time. Right? So 6 months ago when we told you that Ruvain was dead, he wasn't dead. But now he is dead. So in that case, I will say, what did the Mishnah say? The Rishon, so the child she originally had with Shimon is a mamzer, but any kid she has now from this point on won't be mamzerim. So because in that case we make a difference between Rishon and Achron, we just use the same lashon in the previous cases, but in Achnami, in the previous cases, all the kids are mamzerim. Good. Let's go. Not good, but let's go weiter. So Tanah Rabbanon, Zu Divrei Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Sinai, here's what's interesting. One of the cases in the Mishnah was the case like this, where they tell Rachel that your husband died and then your son died. So based on this, Rachel thought that she was not subject to Yibum. So she marries another man. Then it turns out she gets testimony. And what does the testimony say? Opposite. You were subject to Yibum. So we'll say this is actually very interesting. So the Mishnah says that now Rachel married Shimon, right? And unrelated, I will call it Levi. Rachel married Levi, unrelated guy. So what did the Mishnah say? The children she had with Levi are what? Mamzerim. Now, wow. So you're telling me now that if a woman doesn't perform the mitzvah of Yibum, right? She doesn't marry her Yevamos, she marries another man, those kids are Mamzerim. Very interesting. To which the Gemara says, Zodiv Rabbi Akiva, Sheya Omer Ein Kiddushin Tovsin B'Chayvei Lavin. I will say, just to be clear, if a woman marries someone other than her Yevama, that's a lav. So I will say, so the Mishnah says, you're right. The Mishnah reflects the view of Rabbi Akiva, because Rabbi Akiva holds Kiddushin is not Tovsin by Chayvei Lavin, and not only that, Rabbi Akiva holds, therefore, if you go ahead and you marry someone who's a chi of lav, the kids are what? Mamzein. Remember again, this is the extreme position of Rabbi Akiva. Extreme. Rabbi Akiva is a das yachid in this. So our Mishnah is reflecting this particular view. The Gemara says, so the Chum say, the Chum would say, as much as it is illegal for a Yevama to marry someone other than her brother-in-law, if she does so, that union does not produce mamzerim. So the Gemara says, a mamzer mi Yevama, v'lema a mamzer. I'm sorry, avacham or a mamzer mi Yevama, v'lema a mamzer mi chayvei lavin. So why not just say a mamzer mi chayvei lavin? Haytana hachtan Rabbi Akivahu. They both say this Tana must be a different version of Rabbi Akiva. The Amar mechayvei lavin d'she'er have mamzer, mechayvei lavin greedy lo have mamzer. So we'll say interesting that in Rabbi Akiva himself there is a machlokes. What type of chayvei lavin create mamzerus? According to one version of Rabbi Akiva, it's only chayvei lavin that involve relatives that produce mamzerim. But chayvei lavin that ultimately, again, there is no relative issue over here. Like for example, the case of a Yevama who marries someone other than her Yavam, that will not produce mamzerim. Amar Rav Yehuda, Rav Yehuda will say, Amar Beis, Amar Rav, Minayin Shen Kiddushin Tovsin B'Yevama. So I will say, according to Rabbi Akiva, how do you know that Kiddushin is not Tovsin B'Yevama? So I will say, just understand the novelty in this. Right? A simple case. Ruvain's married to Rachel. Ruvain, right? Let's go back. Yibam 101. Ruvain dies without children. Ruvain has a surviving brother, Shimon. There's a mitzvah for Shimon to go ahead and marry Rachel. What happens if Rachel marries Zvulun, an unrelated guy? Shabbos says, remember again, this is a lav. It's an Isser Da'oraisa, Veloti, as we're going to see in just a moment. What the Gemara is introducing us to is that there's a position of Rabbi Akiva who holds that halacha l'maisa, Kiddushin is not tofsin with the Yevama. So if a woman who is subject to Yibum tries to marry another man, that Kiddushin will not take effect, which is dramatic. Because we'll say generally, the only time we say Kiddushin doesn't take effect is where? Like in situations of Isurei Kares. You try to marry your sister, right? Try to marry a married woman. Situations of Isur Kares, Isur Misa, Arayos. So the Gemara says, so Rabbi Yehuda says the name of Rav, where does this school of thought come from that Kiddush is not Tofsim B'Chavei Labin? So watch this. Very simple. Shneimar, Lo Sia Esha Sameis Hachutza Li'ish Zar. The pasuk says, the wife of the dead man, the wife of the mace of the deceased man, shall not Lo Sia, she shall not be Hachutza, to someone outside, to an alien man. Now, here's what's interesting. The Torah uses lashon of what? Sihya. Siyah Rabosai lo sehei ba havia lizar. Siyah always represents a lashon of what? Kiddushin. Siyah is always Kiddushin. So you see over here that the Torah uses a lashon of Kiddushin by a non-related Yavam, right? By a man who's not the Yavam. Telling me that if a man is an Ish Zar, Rabosai, who's a Zar? Who's the Zar in this case? Who's the Zar? Anyone who's not a brother-in-law. Anyone who's not a brother-in-law is an Ish Zar. And what does the Torah say? Lo Siyah. There's no Kiddushin with such a man. Incredible. So the Gemara says, Ushmuel, or Shmuel says, Ba'ani Yosenu tzricha get. So I will say this is very interesting. Shmuel says like this. Let's say Rachel did marry Zvulun. Let's say she accepted Kiddushin from Zvulun, and they had Nisuin, or just Kiddushin, not Nisuin. Shmuel says, I think she's going to require a get from Zvulun. But the way Shmuel phrases it is, Ba'ani Yosenu. Ba'ani Yosenu means in our impoverished state. He's referring over here to our intellectually impoverished state. What Shmuel saying about is at the end, look at Rashi, top Rashi, Mitoch anius da'atenu she'in anu yodin perish hamikra. Shmuel says, I'm not convinced, or we are not convinced about the meaning of this pasuk. Because we're not convinced about the meaning of this pasuk, Shmuel says, I'm not really sure whether or not Kiddushin is tofsin by a man who's not the Yavam. As because I'm not sure, we're going to require a get. That's halachah. Ushmuel Bar says you're going to get misvega. So misapkele l'Shmuel haylo siya hames leishes hames. Sorry, misapkele l'Shmuel hay lo siya ishes hames. Shmuel was not sure how to interpret this pasuk. Ila lav asa. Is it just coming to say that there's a love for the Yevama to marry someone who's not the Yavam? I delo tafsi bu kiddushin dasa. Or is it coming to teach me that Kiddushin Mamish is not tofes in such a situation like this? And therefore, because Shmuel was not sure, therefore Halacha L'maisa Shmuel says, if the Yevama, right, Rachel, does accept Kiddushin and marries Zvulun, again, we're going to force them to dissolve the marriage, but Zvulun is going to have to give Rachel a get. Amar le Rav Mari bar Rachel, the Ravashi, Shamari bar Rachel, that's Ravashi, Hachi Amra Meimar, Hilchasa Kavase de Shmuel. And therefore, I will say in a case where the Yevama does marry someone other than her Yavam, we force this other man to give Rachel a get. Because I will say it's not because we're rejecting the notion that Kiddushin is not tofsin by Yevama. We're just what? We're just not sure. And therefore, in order to be able to cover our bases, we will demand that second husband, in this case Zavulun, gives Rachel the Yevama a get. Incredible. Amar Rashi, Hashad Amar Amemar Helchasa Kavase de Shmuel. So we'll say, listen to this. Rav says, therefore, once Amemar said, Allah follow Shmuel, Im Haya Yevama Kohen, Choletzla V'Sharyala. So listen to this. If that's the case, now that we said that the halacha follows Shimon, which means we'll say we're not sure whether or not Kiddushin is tofsin by Yevama, and therefore halacha l'maisa, we make husband number 2 go ahead and give a get. If that's the case, we'll say if the surviving brother is a Kohen, what will we do in this case? We'll tell surviving brother, you know what? So we'll say here's the interesting issue. If surviving brother is a Kohen, we have a problem. What's the problem? So now she received a get from husband number 2. So I will say, now that was a get given out of suffix, but even a get given out of suffix generally would preclude a woman from marrying a Kohen. So how does she do Yibum? So what do we do in this situation? We tell the surviving brother, do chalitza, choletzla, v'sharyala, and she could remain with husband number 2. To which the Gemara says, what? Is gure iskar? We're going to allow husband number 2 to profit. Im kain matzinu chote niskar. I will say then it'll turn out that what? That a sinner will profit. A sinner will profit. I will say, what is, in general, we have a principle that when people do bad things, we don't want them to profit. I will say, give you a paradigmatic example of this. The halacha is that the ksuva or a besula is 200 zuz, right? So I will say, right? So if a woman is a besula, 200 zuz. A ksuva for a woman who is not a besula is 100 zuz. I will say, let's say the reason why the woman is not a besula is because she lived with her chasan. Chasan has a great chap. I'm going to have my cake and eat it too, right? I'm going to go ahead and live with my kala, and also going to have a cheaper ksuva. So I'll say, what does the halacha say? No, right? Lo yechote niskar, right? Halacha l'maisa, no, you're paying the full 200 zuz for the ksuva. So I will say, so how could it be this guy illegally married? He illegally married the Yevama, right? He should not have married her. So halacha l'maisa, again, now we're going to tell the Yavam to do chalitza, so that ultimately, again, second husband could remain with her. Ela im haya Yevami Yisroel, no sin law sheni yet. Bohutralo. Rather, I was saying, no. What it means is like this. Assuming the Yavam is eligible to still do Yibum, ultimately what we do is we demand that the husband, second husband, go ahead and give a get, so that the Yavam could in fact go ahead and do Yibum. Einachinami, if the Yavam is a Kohen, he's going to be precluded because of other circumstances. Amrav Gidal, Amrav Chiya bar Yosef, Amrav Yevama Kiddushin Einba Nisuin Yeshba. That's an interesting statement. So I'll say Rav Chiya bar Yosef said the name of Rav, the Yevama, so another man cannot affect Kiddushin with her, but he can affect Nisuin with her. Okay? Kiddushin Einba Nisuin Nami Einba doesn't make any sense. If there's no Kiddushin, then there can't be Nisuin. So what's happening over here? What's happening over here? So we'll say, so Bepash, so the Gemara says, Ema Kiddushin V'nisuin Einba. Ultimately, we'll say what it means is that if a man other than the Yavam tries to marry the Yevama, ultimately, again, there is no Kiddushin or Nisuin. And therefore, I will say what that would effectively mean is if the Yevama tries to marry another man, that other man would not be obligated to give her a get. Another possibility is, my Nisuin Yesh. What does it mean when it says Nisuin? Biznus. Ultimately, again, that means znus. Rashi says, Tahavi kiznus. That ultimately, if a Yevama marries someone other than her Yavam, we don't look at that relationship as a marriage. Rather, we look at that relationship as what? Znus. Which means, Rabbi Sanamon, she's not going to need a get. And number two, she'll be permitted to the Yavam. Kid Rav Hamduna, Shomeres Yavam Shazinsa, Asur Yavama. A Shomeres Yavam who committed znus, ultimately, again, becomes prohibited to the Yavam. Maybe it's as we said before, Kiddushin Ein Nisuin Yeshba, maybe means that halacha l'maisa, there's no Kiddushin, but there is Nisuin. What does that mean? The michlefa bi'isha shahalach baila l'medinas hayam. Because we'll say, ultimately, again, we're concerned that you may confuse this with the case of a woman whose husband went overseas. Rabbi Yanai, b'chabura nimnu v'gam. Rabbi say, in our chabura, right, in our group, we decided, ein kiddushin tovsin b'yevama. So we'll say, in our group, we decided that halacha l'maisa, we paskin, kiddushin is not tovsin in the case of a yevama. So we'll say, so remember again, this is the ongoing tension over here. This is the ongoing tension, I will say, which is, here's what everyone agrees with. We have to stop with this for today, but here's what everyone agrees with, right? Number one, what are we agreeing with? That there's a pasuk that says, Lo siya eshes hames hachutza li'ish zar. Right? Everyone is agreeing that the Yevama cannot marry someone who's not her Yavam. I will say, what's the machlokes? What's the nature of the teeth associated with that pasuk? Is the pasuk just saying it's a lav? And because it's a lav, the kiddushin works, but it's aser? Or no, is the pasuk actually saying that what? There is no kiddushin with a man who's not the yavam. That is the ongoing machlokes, and Amir Hashem, the resolution to that machlokes in tomorrow's daf. Shkoyach, everyone. All right, Chevron on Zoom, have a great day, everyone. Great day, Dr. Man. Nice to see you.